Most people start a podcast backwards. They decide they want a podcast, and 5 minutes later, they're comparing microphones, cameras, podcast hosts, remote recording software, lights, probably deciding whether the studio needs a fake plant and a neon sign. Meanwhile, nobody has answered the question that actually determines whether any of that production work is worth doing. What is this podcast supposed to do? If you're starting a podcast, I want to give you 4 decisions to make before you start worrying about equipment. Because the technical part of starting a podcast really isn't the hardest part anymore. You can buy a microphone. You can find recording software. You can open a hosting account. You can upload an episode. The harder part is building a show that still makes sense 20, 30, or 50 episodes from now. So decision number 1 is, what job is the podcast supposed to perform? Maybe you're trying to build authority around your expertise. Maybe the podcast is supposed to educate potential customers. Maybe you're building an email audience. Maybe you want the show to help generate inquiries, start sales conversations, support a community, or create useful content for the rest of your business. Those are all legitimate reasons to podcast, but they're not the same reason. And that's important because the job of the podcast starts affecting almost every decision that comes after it. Here's a simple example. Let's say you're a web designer and you start a podcast for business owners. If the goal is just, I want to grow an audience, you can talk about almost anything. Websites, marketing, AI, business, entrepreneurship, whatever sounds interesting that week. But if the job of the podcast is to become a trusted resource for businesses preparing for a website redesign, suddenly the content becomes much clearer. You can teach people how to prepare for a redesign, what mistakes cost businesses time, how to organize their website content, how to evaluate a developer, what conversion problems to look for. Same host, same microphone, completely different podcast. Because now the show has a job. Decision number 2 is, who exactly should listen? And don't just say business owners. That's millions of people who may have very little in common. What problem does your listener have? What are they trying to understand? What are they trying to do? Why should they choose your podcast instead of the other 50 things fighting for their attention? Once you get that clear, your episode topics usually get better. Your titles get easier. Your examples get more specific. Even your guest choices get easier because now you can ask, does this guest actually help the person who this show is for? Decision number 3 is, what kind of show can you realistically produce? This is where people can accidentally build themselves a second full-time job. You might see a big video podcast with 3 cameras, full lighting setup, guests every week, 10 social clips, custom graphics, and a giant production team. Great. That doesn't mean that's the show you should build. Maybe your best version is 1 useful 15-minute solo episode every week. Maybe it's 2 interviews a month. Maybe video makes sense. Maybe it doesn't yet. There isn't one correct podcast format. The right format is the one that serves the listener and fits the production capacity you actually have. Because a podcast you can sustain is a lot more useful than a massive production system you hate by episode 6. And decision number 4 is, what should happen after somebody listens? This one gets ignored all the time. A listener reaches the end of the episode. Now what? Maybe you want them to listen to another episode. Maybe there's a free guide that helps them take the next step. Maybe you want them on your email list. Maybe the episode naturally connects to a service, product, a class, membership, or consultation. You don't need to turn every episode into a sales pitch. You do need to think about where the podcast fits into the rest of what you're building. Because if your goal is for the podcast to support a business, a brand, organization, or professional practice, there should eventually be some connection between the value you're giving people and the job the podcast is supposed to perform. And only after you've made these decisions would I start obsessing over the microphone. Because now you're not just buying podcast gear, you're building a show. The purpose affects the listener. The listener affects the topics. The topics affect the format. The format affects the production workload. All of that affects what you should actually measure once the podcast is running. That's the part most start a podcast checklists miss. They give you a shopping list. They give you a hosting platform. They tell you how to upload an MP3. But those are only pieces of the system. If you want the complete process, I put together a 9-step guide that takes you from defining the job of the podcast all the way through recording, workflow, hosting, distribution, launch, and figuring out whether the show is actually working. You'll find the full blueprint at the link in the description. Build the podcast in the right order, then go buy the microphone.